Good evening, Michael. Can you hear me?
Perfectly now, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining. And we will start in another minute. So it's a great pleasure, honor to have you with us for this program. And I happen to hear you at the AI program hosted by USC in December. And the compelling vision and dream which you talked about, developing humanity as a multi-planetary species. And when you look at today, I mean, we have been talking about the climate change. The Earth is becoming hotter and hotter and hotter, and unpredictable weather patterns, not good for maybe 100 years or 500 years down the line. We should look at another planet. But more so now in the current conflict, the political conflict, the war situation, we don't know how long Earth will be habitable for people. So we have to have a vision. We have to first to have a dream, a compelling dream, based on which we will develop technologies that we will be able to move to another planet. And if we move to another planet, what should be the systems and technologies that can support us? That's exactly what we want to discuss. And after you, our friend Samer will be talking about the architecture, outer space architecture and energy systems. So without wasting any more time, over to you, Michael, for your address. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the generous introduction. And you know, what an honor to kick off the morning to be able to share some of my experience and my story, which hopefully is relevant to many of the activities taking place around the world. So, in terms of my personal story, you know, I studied at the London School of Economics, and I actually, as a graduate student, had intended to pursue not only studies but also occupationally. I wanted to focus on nuclear disarmament, and so and part of that experience was to learn and understand about international treaty law. And it was just after getting my degree in arms control that I then had the privilege of going back to Washington, D.C. and participate in foreign policy think tank. And at the time, I was a young graduate student, and arms control was considered to be probably the sexiest topic at the time, because this was still during the Cold War. And they asked me if I would participate in the international communications portion of the think tank. And at the time, that was a very boring area. And I had some of the background skills from my graduate studies. So I said, okay, I can do this boring subject until something more exciting comes along. And in 1988, I had the pleasure of attending the International Space University that was held at MIT. And one of my classmates in 1988 was Professor Madhu Thangalavu, who was a great inspiration. And even then, as a graduate student, had already started thinking about some very modular and innovative techniques for architecture. And after that experience at MIT, and after graduating from the International Space University, I was very, very fortunate in October 1988 to win a scholarship to the International Astronautical Congress, which in 1988 was held in Bangalore, India. And so you can imagine how much the world has changed and how much everything has changed in Bangalore in India since my experience in 1988. And when I came back from that experience, I gave a paper on human rights and lunar bases. You know, so this was in 1988. It was a very visionary subject. And when I came back to the United States, I went back to work in the field of international communications. And suddenly that area of infrastructure, which was so boring, it was so monopolistic, there was very little innovation, the costs were extremely high. all of a sudden that field started to take off, and there was deregulation, there was innovation, there was competition, there was lowering of prices, and it gave consumers a lot of choices. And so there's some themes that I've been fortunate enough to experience since my time in Bangalore. But starting off with human rights, working with telecommunications and infrastructure, and working with outer space. So let me start off by talking about this vision of accelerating humanity as a multiplanetary species. I went through an exercise. I was asked to give a talk at the Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian Institute, part of the Air and Space Museum. And as part of that presentation, I realized I had to do a lot more research, not only on the strategic strategy of NASA, but I was very, very interested in the space strategies of the handful of countries that were leading the world in space. And one of the things I was interested in is what were some of the similarities and differences in strategy. And I was really surprised that not a single space agency that I found in the entire world was interested in an organizing and strategic concept of, uh, of their purpose as a space agency of participating and helping to make humanity a multiplanetary species. And if you look at many of the strategies of many of the space agencies, oftentimes it's fairly boring material. It's about procurement, about growing jobs, growing the industrial bases of those countries. And, and quite frankly, with many countries, it's really national industrial policy, and it's really jobs policy. And I think that there's something spiritual and there's something fundamental missing when space agencies just focus on politics, jobs, and money, and not about really trying to accomplish real things in space, and most importantly, not really working to make humanity a multiplanetary species. We're going through a very difficult time right now globally as a planet, and I think most of us on this who are participating in this conference are very surprised about the threats of nuclear war recently from Russia. And, as a former arms controller 33 years ago in the middle of the Cold War, it's shocking that we've emerged from a bipolar world. We emerged from, this kind of Cold War positioning, and now we're back to those days of threat and anxiety and anxiousness. And I think for me, it's really a lesson about how important it is to ensure that humanity survives and excels as a species, whether it's here on Earth or off planet. And I think that, as policymakers, as decision makers, as people who are able to have influence, to be thought leaders, it's important that we're inspired to think about humanity in the greater context. And it doesn't matter if it's nuclear war, it doesn't matter if it's global warming, it doesn't matter if it's pandemic. And we've been failing in a lot of these areas, importantly. And I think it's important from an aspirational point of view, a spiritual point of view. It was beautiful that we kicked off this morning's conference with the practice of yoga. I mean, there's something that's in our souls that we're looking for in terms of individuals and in terms of communities, in terms of humanity more generally, in terms of aspiration, in terms of inspiration, in terms of creativity, imagination. And there's a lot of critics who often say, well, why should we be going to space? There's so many problems on Earth. And it doesn't matter if it's India, doesn't matter if it's the United States or China. There are people say, hey, well, there are people who are hungry, they don't eat, or people who don't have medical care, or people who don't have education. And I would argue that we can do both. We can provide food and education, and at the same time we can elevate the vision and dreams of humanity and achieve those dreams and those visions. It was interesting when Professor Thangalavu and myself attended the International Space University. We had the good fortune of being given a lecture by a great professor and a practitioner who argued, and it was interesting, arguing before a university that was mostly filled with tech. And she argued that that when it came to important decisions related to space and to technology, she argued that politics always wins. And engineers don't want to hear about that. Engineers want to solve problems, they want to be given budgets, and they want to execute on what needs to be done. And the last thing that they want to hear about is inefficient, suboptimal outcomes being driven by what technical people often view as irrational, emotional, sentiments. And it's interesting to put into context the importance of humanity as a multiplanetary species and to consider the prospects of accelerating that. It's humbling because the Wright brothers and flight was pioneered 118 years ago. And in some ways, it seems like a very long time ago. And in some ways, it doesn't seem like a very long time ago. And if you look at the Apollo moon landings 52 years ago, and again, maybe similar sentiments, which, some ways it doesn't seem like such a long time ago. And in other ways, it seems like a very, very long time ago. And, part of the crisis between Russia and the Ukraine has led to a lot of threats and has led to a lot of accusations about the end of the International Space Station. It's an extraordinary feat. For the last 2 decades, humanity has occupied low Earth orbit through the International Space Station. And one of the important partners has been the Russians. And they've been an important part of ensuring that the space station is fueled and is able to do station keeping. And so as part of this conflict that has only really reared its ugly head in a spectacular way over the last week, there's now been concerns and thoughts about risks to the International Space Station. And I don't think that's something that's really even a nation state type of domain, because this is something that we want all of humanity to learn from. And in some ways it captures and it typifies some of the great things that can be done by countries working together. And in the presentation I gave recently on the subject of accelerating humanity as a multiplanetary species, one of the things that I argue about is really the need for the rebirth of grand strategy. Let's move beyond some of the tactical, political issues. Let's start talking about reimagining grand strategy. And I have to tell you, India's done a fantastic job in terms of creating an infrastructure to explore and to develop outer space. But I think that that all countries can do a better job in terms of reimagining grand strategy and trying to really go beyond the parochial politics that we often see in our countries. And recently I had the good fortune of writing a thought piece with a professor at Stanford University, and that's Professor Ben Schwiegler. And we argue that it's possible to accelerate billions of people out of poverty through strategically planned infrastructure. And so this is the moment in my talk where I really like to try to bring together so many threads of my personal life, my professional life, which started off with everything from arms control to satellite communications to communications infrastructure to this this call to try to accelerate humanity becoming a multiplanetary species and really trying to elevate all of humanity beyond threats of nuclear war, beyond threats of pandemic, beyond threats of global warming, and really trying to ensure that under almost any eventuality that humanity as we know it can continue to exist. Either, you know, we want it to flourish on the planet, but in almost any eventuality, we want to make sure that it flourishes in space. It's interesting when people talk about infrastructure, you know, there's a lot of people, I think, in the general public that find infrastructure kind of boring. They don't get excited about it. It's not passionate. Obviously, roads and rail and aircraft are, you know, visible aspects of infrastructure. But I think people they take it for granted over time. But so much of infrastructure is invisible, so it's hard to get excited about the sewage systems underground, and even water systems and gas systems and so forth. And I think one of the, and I'd argue that the similarity with some of the challenges relating to accelerating humanity as a multiplanetary species, and some of the challenges related to accelerating infrastructure, which in turn can accelerate humanity out of poverty, are some of the similar characteristics, which is that many of the functional areas in these domains are very siloed. And so with specialization, things get extremely siloed, and it's difficult to communicate outside of these silos. And I think that's in some ways that's a challenge, again, for all of us as, you know, thought leaders and as policymakers and people who have influence, economic and you know, political and regulatory influence, which is how do we create a system where we can start to look at things more holistically? Again, you know, going back to the beautiful practice of starting this morning with yoga, right? That's one of the most holistic, kinetic things that somebody can participate in. But really trying to look at these aspirations in space holistically, our aspirations for accelerating infrastructure, looking at it more holistically. I mean, some of the challenges are there's even on any frontier, whether it's space or infrastructure, when infrastructure starts moving quickly, there's not even an agreement on some of the fundamental terms of related to infrastructure. So, for example, I've been one of the champions of something called Dig Once, which is anytime you build a road or you expand a road, that you try to bring order to the infrastructure at the same time. And there are a lot of different names for the same discipline. Some people call it Dig Once, some people call it bundling, some people call it co-deployment. There's a lot of terms that refer to the same or very similar concepts. And it's going to be hard to come up with coherent strategies when there's not even a consensus on some of the fundamental terms. And I would argue that in the next decade or two, there's going to be trillions of dollars spent globally on infrastructure, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the obvious reasons, I think, is that as countries try to put people back to work after pandemic and try to jumpstart these economies, one of the ways to do that is to put a lot of money into infrastructure. But the second thing is that there's going to be a lot more hardening of infrastructures. And a lot of the infrastructures around the world are very vulnerable to things like cyber attack. So it's another reason, another argument that we need to be very focused and disciplined, and we have to invest additional resources in these areas. But I think that the architectural and engineering practices around these concepts of integrated infrastructure, of dig once, of bundling, of co-deployment, those design and engineering practices there's a tremendous opportunity to develop those and to roll those out. And maybe, and I'm happy to take questions, but I maybe we close with one sort of additional thought, which is that infrastructure traditionally has been a very linear pursuit for the most part. And I think, historically, the way infrastructure has been developed has been, again, one silo at a time. Let's develop the railways, and then separately, okay, now let's develop the telegraph, and okay, now let's develop, roads and water and other infrastructure. And I think that's what led to a lot of the siloization. There's two important things. Number one, there's the challenge of resiliency with infrastructure, which is that infrastructure wasn't designed with resiliency, and there weren't a lot of policies or incentives for infrastructure to be resilient. And part of that's because of these siloization. And I can just say that there are many countries around the world, including some very developed countries, and every time there's a storm, every time there's a hurricane or a cyclone, all the above ground infrastructure, or most of it, gets wiped out. And so if they have above ground power, above ground communications, that gets wiped out, and then they have to get rebuilt. And one of the problems with that is that traditionally it's the ratepayers who pay to get it repaired. So there just are not the incentives for it to be designed and executed properly up front. And I would say, finally, when it comes to resiliency, I think one of the things to consider is the concept of what I would call exponential infrastructure, which is, if you're going to be spending trillions and trillions of dollars over the next decades globally, and that's the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and national governments and ratepayers and so forth, we want to get the greatest amount of returns possible on those investments. And part of that can be done through resiliency, so that we don't have to rebuild every time there's a storm or a flood or an earthquake. But another part of it is trying to get incredibly high leverage technologies and techniques to better manage and control our infrastructure. And just one example, and it comes from space, and there's another tie-in between this making humanity multiplanetary species, but also infrastructure on Earth, which is recently there's been a lot of developments and innovation in the synthetic aperture radar satellites. And by building constellations of SAR satellites, we can identify to an incredibly small degree any changes in these are optimized really for man-made type of geometric objects. But for example, we can monitor all the dams worldwide around the Earth, and if there's the slightest change in movement in a dam, the relevant people could be alerted. And so again, that's a technology that is very inexpensive but incredibly high leverage, and it allows us that ability to have that impact, that exponential impact, so that we could really achieve this goal of accelerating humanity out of poverty through smart infrastructure and strategic thinking about infrastructure. So, I'd like to conclude and thank everyone for taking time to listen to kind of my personal story as it relates to some subjects I feel very, very passionate about. And I'd really look forward to answering any questions if there's time for that.
Michael, thank you very much for those thoughts. If I ask you, what would be the next planet which we could colonize? Is it Moon? Is it Mars? Is it what is uh, possible, or the first one?
Yeah. So, it's a great debate, right? And and part of that goes back to politics, right? So some policymakers argue that the moon is not inspiring enough to raise the resources and to unify populations to support that sort of effort. And so some people argue that Mars has the characteristics that might inspire people so that we can get the consensus nationally within countries to pursue something that ambitious. And that debate is playing out between NASA and Elon Musk has been very, very vocal about the importance of going to Mars, and he's creating an architecture and a strategy for doing that. So I think right now, all the money right now is on the moon. The Artemis program seems like it's going forward. The Europeans have put resources behind it. NASA has signed up a number of countries to be Artemis partners. And, the big question is it going to be done really through the brute force of governments, or is it really going to be done through the entrepreneurism of the private marketplace? And I think it's largely going to be the entrepreneurs, but I think that it's going to be almost like an economic development play where the governments play an important role in terms of stimulating the economic investments. But at the end of the day, if we want to make it sustainable and efficient, I think it's going to be the entrepreneurs and the commercial players.
Another thought is that okay, at one point in time Venus was habitable, it became too hot, so life emerged on Earth. So and today we consider Mars as too cold, and say hundreds or thousands or how many years down the line Mars will be habitable from the perspective of what we have on Earth today.
So I think, and that's one of the criticism about returning to Mars is that, there's a number of innovations. It's going to cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and maybe the realization that it may be a one-way trip, right? That we may not be bringing these people back. So I think those are all issues. And one of the very important issues, again, fundamental infrastructure issue, is how do we power a lot of this stuff, and do we allow nuclear power on the moon and Mars and so forth? And that debate is not finished, but I think it's essential, and I think that we're going to need, certainly in the short to medium term, we're going to have to rely on nuclear energy, which can also solve some of the problems with temperature, particularly cold temperature.
We have our friend Samer El Sayary, who will working on the architecture, outer space architecture and energy systems. So ask these questions to him.